It's like the same thing here is the light vibration. There's activities in the region about vibration, which I personally understand because I'm practice everyone vibration. Because for them, it's like you talk about vibration, you talk about giving up on the adaptation.
And I actually
that's what's in John recently wrote Nature. Yeah, this year.
Hallo, ich soll von der Kommunikation fragen, wo das denn läuft.
Ja. Heute ist der Link.
Ja, das wäre super.
Über Twitter direkt nachricht. Du wolltest haben.
Sind Sie mit dem DE verlinken oder per Mail einfach?
Ja.
Soll ich es einfach gerade selber
Ja, das wäre
eingeben?
super. Good morning.
when I saw you the other day, and they're partially like towards the front, so there's some. Yeah.
Is it climate change 100% or different?
Well, at first they tried to say because of subsidence, but now the more information that I bring, it's more likely than not. There's a regional park. And there are processes really already get into. Yeah.
I saw something and it looks all like very paradise-like.
No, it doesn't look paradise. I mean, maybe it does, but this not this story.
I know there was a contrast between the some beautiful images of
Right. Yeah, their water is completely. Yeah.
Dozens of people upstairs. I also heard from Stephen. So I've told students to take care of it. Sure, Stephen Ottawa has a place to stay. He called me. Well, she's coming for the workshop at the table. We have a hotel room anyway. Yeah, he called me.
Yeah, I'm also not 100% sure.
We had
Okay. Yeah, sure. No problem. Thank you.
I'm looking forward.
How are you doing?
How are you? No, don't worry. It's perfect.
Okay. 3 minutes. Number 7 is not next to number 6.
My certificate. Yeah. I don't know. I was standing there talking to and yes, and I turned back and my stuff was gone. We're not everything, just all my papers. So yeah, that's. Yeah. It's over there.
People staring at us.
No, not necessarily.
Bring the presentations, you can sit here and then so Yes.
Okay, good morning and a very warm welcome to our side event, Adaptation in Motion, under which conditions can migration contribute to climate change adaptation. My name is Benjamin Schraden and I'm a senior researcher of the German Development Institute, DIE, also working on different facets of international migration. This so-called interconnection zone is a joint effort of DIE, and in particular DIE's Klimaluk project and BMZ, the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. Jointly, this forum tries to look at both climate change and human development related issues in a wider perspective, and I really would like to thank BMZ, the Klimaluk project, and I would also like to thank the Transfer Project, University of Bonn in particular, Harald Sterli, for really making this whole event doable. If you would like to clap your hands, I think right now would be a good moment. Yeah, talking about climate change and migration. I think also in the context of this COP, we hear and read a lot about climate refugees. We hear about estimates that there might be 200 to 250 million people who by the middle of this century might have to leave their homestead as climate change in the form of rising sea levels, storms, droughts and so on have made them totally uninhabitable. And these people then might come to Europe. And I think both aid organizations, NGOs, as well as policymakers really like these numbers and estimates quite a lot. Either to raise the awareness for climate protection measures, and some certainly also for, carefully speaking, other reasons. Interestingly, these alarmist projections and estimates, numbers, are a bit at odds with the scientific debate on the interlinkages between climate change and human mobility. This debate, which has its origins maybe already back in the 1970s, 1980s, certainly has intensified since the early 2000s. And apart from single case studies focusing on the effects of environmental change, climate change, on human security, human livelihoods, including human mobility, apart from these, several larger research projects were initiated, like the Foresight project, the IOM-led MICLA project, or the UNU EHS led project Where the Rain Falls. So I think all in all, certainly we do not have something like a global survey on climate change and migration, but I think basically we can make some general statements about this interconnection between climate change, environmental deterioration, and human mobility. I think generally it's really quite hard, if not impossible, to really define what climate change, environmentally induced migration, climate refugees, what that really is. Because there are no automatisms between climate change and migration, as human migration decisions are complex and very multi-dimensional. So that means they're not only influenced by ecological factors, doing climate change, but also by political factors, economic factors, by demographic factors, cultural factors, and so on and so on. And it's really hard to measure the dominance of climate change or other environmental factors in these mobility decisions. Furthermore, there's also something which is called trapped populations. That means some people are so poor they do not have the necessary resources to migrate at all. Or they become immobilized and virtually trapped by the consequences of climate change. But if you look at migration processes which are taking place in the context of climate change, we see that migration basically also might be used to cope with the adverse effects of climate change or to adapt to these. But of course that also raises some questions. So under which conditions is migration actually a form of adaptation? Which forms of migration are adaptation, and how could this notion of migration as a form of adaptation be politically fostered? And this is something that we would like to discuss in the following. Therefore, we've invited the following presenters. The first presentation will be by Michaela OBrien, IOM, International Organization for Migration, focusing on climate adaptation and the global governance of migration, reality or utopia. Then we have three rather regional case studies looking at the interconnections. The first one will be by Professor Patrick Zaktaporak, University of Vienna, focusing on Thailand. Then we will hear Kees van der Geest from the United Nations University Institute for Environment and Human Security, focusing on the Marshall Islands. After that, we will hear a presentation about Fiji and Vanuatu by Cosmin Gondea, also United Nations University. And finally, we'll hear a presentation by Vanessa Louie, University of Arizona, which is a bit enigmatic so far. I only know the title, Adaptation in Motion, Influential Interconnections. What it will be about in the end is a bit of a surprise. So after that, the presentations will be in a row, 10 minutes per presentation. So after that, we have about 45 minutes time for discussion, questions and answers. And before we close, about 10 minutes before, Harald Sterli will try to formulate some key messages, take-home messages from the session. So, Mariam, I kindly invite you to start with the first presentation.
Hello everyone, it's a pleasure to be here. So I'm Mariam Traoré-Chazal-Noël. I work at the International Organization for Migration as a specialist in migration, environment and climate change in New York. Such a pleasure to be here, to partner again with Transray, been working with them a lot, and it's always a pleasure to take part in these events. So I will try to be short because I think the colleagues here have very concrete things to say about their case study in the field. So let me just talk a little bit about what's going on in the negotiations in terms of migration and climate change, and see indeed, like, are we going towards discussing adaptation or not? I'm very glad that we can speak here, I think a little bit more freely than in UN events, and Cosmin here can confirm. So that's why I titled the presentation Reality or Utopia. I wouldn't be able to discuss that with negotiators. But since we are amongst friends here, we can try to talk about it. Okay, so first of all, at IWAP we think it's important, and we cannot underestimate the fact that finally migration is discussed in the climate negotiations. It might seem obvious now, because you go to this event, you go to lots of other events. I think there are more than 20 events this year dedicated to migration or mobility or displacement and climate change. But if you just step back even a few years ago, 2009 in Copenhagen, there was absolutely nothing. So the first mention of migration appeared in Cancun in 2010, but let's say that it's only in the last 2 to 3 years that there's a lot of interest in this question at the political level. And to me, that's also thanks to the researcher community who's bringing results and data and qualitative case studies, and I think bringing the attention to this topic in the policy area. So on the climate negotiation side, this discussion is taking place under the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage. So of course, loss and damage, not adaptation. I must say from my perspective, as someone who attends this meeting related to human mobility and loss and damage, we never pronounce the word adaptation. We never talk about migration as an adaptation strategy. Even for us in our documents, we are presenting this as how to understand migration so we can help people to cope, or other kind of euphemism. So we are not really pronouncing the word adaptation because we sense that there is a resistance there. And it's so difficult already to talk about migration, generally speaking, that we are trying to just not focus so much on the words, but just talk about the ideas, and eventually we do believe that we will talk about adaptation, but maybe in a slightly, let's say, twisted and different way. So the main work under the Warsaw International Mechanism, it's this task force on displacement that I'm sure most of you have heard about, which is to look for solutions to prevent, avert, and minimize displacement linked to climate change. So within that vague and wide framework, I think there is space to discuss what we here are calling adaptation, but with other words. In parallel to this, it's also important to note that we have global migration policy negotiations, which are taking place at the United Nations under this process called the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration. So under this Global Compact, which should be adopted next year by all UN member states, there are references to climate change. Right now, it was the stock-taking process. There will be a series of meetings, a stock-taking exercise in a couple of weeks, the first draft of this compact. My sense is that there will be some references to climate change and environmental issues as drivers, root causes of migration. But so far, I'm not seeing anything related to, again, using the word adaptation. That might also be because this compact is dedicated to international migration, and a lot of what we call migration adaptation can be applied to internal movements. Nonetheless, again, even if we don't pronounce the word adaptation, there is again scope to promote positive solutions in terms of migration that can help people cope with climate change. So these are the two, let's say, policy strands. So to summarize, we talk about adaptation, but not really pronouncing the word adaptation. However, the work is also around finding solutions, which to me means also finding adaptation solutions. I think on the policy side, that was a brief summary. What I just wanted to add is that in practice, the colleagues here will talk about country-specific issues, but at IOM we've been conceptualizing what we see as migration as adaptation. It's a very imperfect framework, people might agree or disagree, but we are seeing three strands to that. First, it's to help people to stay. Adaptation, why? Because it's targeting areas where there are already high rates of immigration, targeting these areas to focus on climate adaptation so that people have the choice not to go. Of course, some people will use this as an excuse to say, oh, people cannot migrate and they shouldn't migrate because no one wants them elsewhere. I mean, there's a risk that this is the discourse, how it will turn. But in our perspective, what we are trying to say here is that if we are focusing on adaptation in areas where we see a conjunction of risk, then it means that people will be able to stay if they want to stay. Then the second strand here is that for these people who are already on the move, either because they're forced or they decided to go, we have some example of pilot projects that help migrants in transit, offering them, let's say, job solutions in the land rehabilitation sector, so that again they have a choice to migrate or not migrate, or maybe go back home. Again, there's always the risk that some political forces hijack these kind of programs, again, to try to stop migration. The third aspect here, and I think everyone will more or less talk about it, so I won't say much, it's the labor migration aspect and facilitated migration. How do you expand or create migration schemes between regions of origins that are threatened by climate change and areas of destination where, for instance, you have a labor shortage? So this has been done in the Pacific. I'm sure someone will explain more. But there is scope to do a lot more thinking around the policy and operationalization of these schemes worldwide. And then finally, we would say for us, another aspect of the migration adaptation is how do you involve migrant communities abroad, the ones who are already moved to Europe or other neighboring countries. How do you empower them so that they can help investing, for instance, in climate change adaptation or land rehabilitation? Again, there are some examples of pilot projects between Italy and 3 countries in West Africa. All of this, I would say, it's all at the kind of experimental stage, because as we all know here, we do have an issue with funding. Funding migration and climate change interventions is not easy, but in terms of how we conceptualize this migration as adaptation nexus, how we go to donors and governments and propose these strategies, this is what we're trying to do. Thank you very much.
Hello everybody, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Ben, for the opportunity to share my views with all of you today. My name is Patrick Saktaporak. I'm a professor for population geography at the University of Vienna, and at the same time also a research group leader of the Trans3 project, which is based here.
Can you just wait a minute? It's just not.
Which is based here in Bonn. Yeah, and in my talk today I will present some insights from this project, from this ongoing project on the issue of migration as adaptation. No problem.
Sorry, 1 minute.
I think for some slides you don't need actually to see the slides. I can convey the message to you also already without you having been able to read it. Perhaps first of all, there are 3 messages that I want to convey to you this morning. The first one is that migration should, in the context of climate change, should not be considered always as a problematic issue. We have heard that in the first presentation. Migration can be part, actually, of the solution for successful adaptation. I think we have to remind ourselves of this. The second thing is that migration leads to increasing connectedness between people and places. diaspora communities in the places of destination of migrants, and to these networks that are established, financial and social remittances can be transferred. And this can support actually resilience building, making people more resilient against the impact of climate change. We have to keep in our, we have to think about that the success of migration adaptation also depends on the conditions in the place of destination of migration. So we not only should focus on the places of origin of migrants, but should think about the impact of the conditions in place of destinations of migrants as well. And this is what the title of my presentation, which you couldn't see, is about the translocal perspective and the multi-local perspective on the issue of migration as adaptation. So the starting point for our engagement in the Trans3 project with this issue is that that migration is an integral part of the globalized world. It's normality, basically. The UNDP is estimating the number of internal migrants to be 740 million, and the number of international migrants to be 214 million. So migration is happening already, but the feedback processes of migration on adaptation in the areas of origin of migrants is not so much the focus of policy and research so far. So that's what we want to address. And what from our perspective, from the outside, we have the impression that there's a strong focus on displacement and relocation here, as well as at the COP. And it's working. Yeah, great. Thank you very much. And that migration as adaptation needs to be put into focus. Yeah, and we have to remind ourselves that migration can be both. It's not per se a good or a bad thing, right? Migration can, in the context of climate change, can be an indicator for failed adaptation, actually. When livelihood systems of households are broken down, people have no choice but to leave to engage in distress migration, which then leads to a decreasing level of well-being of these households. But migration also can be a sign of successful adaptation. When households under stress, sending members away to earn money in the city, they're sending money back and stabilizes the livelihood security of households that are left behind. So, in my opinion, the crucial issue for the assessment of migration as a success or a failure is related to the degree of freedom and choice people have in their decision to move or to stay, and in order to maintain and or increase their well-being, so they can move or stay. And I think the necessary focus we have to put on is to enhance the freedom of choice of people. So in the Trans3 project, we want to address this issue. We'll be looking at the social and ecological changes that are induced by feedback process of migration to the place of origin of migrants, and we're particularly interested in the effects on social resilience to environmental risks in the place of origin of migrants. So while there's a lot of focus on the impact of migration, impact of environmental change on migration decision, how, for example, droughts, floods actually leading to a situation where people are forced to move, we are turning this, we're looking at the issue from another perspective, saying that migration is happening anyway, regardless of the impact of climate change, and we want to understand how this migration actually influences the place of origin of migrants in terms of their ability to cope and adapt to environmental risks. So we are conducting our research in Thailand, in the place of origin and place of destination of migrants, because we are arguing if you want to understand this relationship, you need to focus on both sides of migration. So we are conducting research in rural areas of origin of migrants, areas that are dependent on rain-fed agriculture, which are remote, and we are following the migrants to the place of destination. We are following them to see how the working and living conditions are in urban centers in Thailand, in the area of Bangkok, but also following them internationally and looking at what are the situations of contract workers, Thai contract workers, for example, in Singapore, or marriage migrants who are migrating to Germany. And with this kind of multi-local view, we want to understand how it works actually, migration is adaptation, and what could be recommended also for policymakers. To exemplify this, what we are doing, I want to address two case studies which represent different pathways. One on stagnation and decline of unsuccessful migration and adaptation, and one of pathway of growth of successful migration and adaptation. So the first case is the case of Nun. She's a 42-year-old garment worker in Bangkok who is originally from the northeast Thailand, a rural agricultural-based poor area in Thailand. She has 11 siblings, has just primary education, and her family in the northeast is very poor with very limited access also to land. She's divorced and lives with her 2 kids in the city. She's not able to send her kids to rural areas because the conditions are too bad. Due to her low educational status, she's precariously employed and with a subcontractor in the textile industry, and under rather kind of precarious working and living conditions. So after the last drought, which happened in Thailand recently, she had to get an informal loan to support her family back home. So what situations we have here is that she's just managing to live her life in Bangkok. She's not able to accumulate to enhance her well-being. And the households in the rural areas are depending on her, and both are depending on each other, but are not able to improve their situation. And it's also, kind of trapped in a coping trap where they are just managing to get by. A second example is the example of Bonn. He's 45 years old. He's coming also from a poor family in the rural area. When he was 19, he decided to go to Singapore to work there and stayed there actually 21 years. He made some career in Singapore, became a foreman. He was able to send 1,500 euros back to home each month. With this money, they bought land. When he came back, he could use his skills. He worked in the construction sector to build houses. There he kind of adopted also a business attitude. He invested in a pig farm, a karaoke bar. So he managed to use his money and his skills he got from the foreign country to kind of diversify the income generating activities of the household and being less basically sensitive to climatic risks. So what I want to say here, we need to make migration work for adaptation. So first of all, we need to strengthen the capacity of the vulnerable to adapt. We need to increase their freedom to decide to move or to stay. We need to overcome the sedentary bias in our thinking, and which often leads to policies that try to prevent migration. We need to acknowledge the potential of migration, and therefore we should decrease the obstacles for migration, as we have seen in the example of a person who's then managed to move to Singapore, that migration has a great potential to enhance the resilience of households to deal with environmental risks. And we need to create working and living conditions in the place of destination for migrants, which actually allow migrants to support their places of origin and to allow them to improve their well-being. And the case study of Nun from Bangkok shows that if these working and living conditions are precarious, migration as adaptation doesn't have the full positive potential. And with this, I would like to end my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Good morning, everybody. Great to see a good show up and a lot of young people in the room. I think the average age here is about 10 to 50 years younger than in the rest of the COP. So this is a good sign for the future. My name is Kees van der Geest. I am working at United Nations University, but the research I present here is for University of Hawaii. So I'll present also on behalf of the team. This is Juno from left to right, Professor Maxime Burkett, she's leading this project. Then our local counterpart Mark Steggy in the Marshall Islands, and then me, when I had a little bit more hair. That's just last year, by the way. So I'm taking you in this presentation to the Marshall Islands. As you see on the map, it's a little dot in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. but I'll zoom in on it a bit later. So Marshall Island is one of the lowest lying islands in the world, and as you probably all know, those islands are particularly vulnerable to sea level rise, and with sea level rise there are a number of threats to the livelihoods of these people and the security actually. So because of sea level rise, when storms come, when floods come, they have a much higher impact, and these affect the ecosystems that people depend on for their livelihoods, which really could lead to the decision to move to a safer place. So what we see is that from the Marshall Islands, which there are only like a bit more than 50,000 people who are Marshallese, in the year 2000, 7,000 were living, around 7,000 were living in the US, and in 10 years that amount tripled to 22,000 in 2010, and all signs of investigations between census, it looks like that amount is further increasing pretty fast. So about a third of the Marshallese people are no longer in the Marshall Islands. So what we really want to figure out in this research, this is by the way a 2 or 3 year project, depending on the funding, and we are at the end of year 1. So findings I present here are a bit preliminary. But what we want to find out is whether there's a connection between the threat of climate change and people's decision to migrate, and to also so there's also a better connection to the focus of this particular panel, which is the question like, is migration also an adaptation? We look at impacts of migration for the migrants themselves, for the places they go to, and the places they come from. So we say, what are the impacts of migration in source and destination areas? But you could rephrase that to say, like, is this migration like a successful adaptation, or does it come with much loss and damage or adverse effects? So maybe I won't go into details, but this is our climate migration impact chain that we developed for this research. Basically, it just says that, look, people don't migrate directly because of climate change, but there's a lot in between. So climate change or climatic stressors have an impact on ecosystems. People depend on those ecosystems, so they are affected indirectly in their livelihoods, their food security, but also their safety of the habitability of their islands. And based on the perceptions of those, they would decide to either stay or to go. And when they make that decision, that can have like different impacts. But what makes it, of course, much complicated is that there are always all those other factors that influence the main parts of this chain. So we've done research in the Marshall Islands in 3 different islands. You see that in those arrows. That's Majuro is the capital island, and then 2 outer islands. And in the US, so we also, just like the research Patrick presented, we do research in source and destination areas, and I think that's really important to do. So currently my colleague Juno, who you saw in the first picture, is doing research in Oregon and Washington State. So it's still really much ongoing. So this is a map of the places where people go to in the US. And most people from the Marshall Islands go to the US if they migrate internationally. So they go to Hawaii, that's the #1 destination. Then funnily or interestingly, this is Arkansas, which has a huge concentration of Marshallese people who work in poultry factories there. So one guy went there 20 or 30 years ago, then his brothers and his cousins, and they stick together there. So this is what the places we researched in the Marshall Islands look like. We have two different types of islands or environments. You have the atolls and you have the islands. And so the one on the right is Medjid, and the dots you see there are the households we interviewed. And we would like to, besides our social science research, we do some spatial analysis of the data from the household questionnaire related to environmental indicators, which we use like geographic information systems to analyze that. So just a few pictures, what our study sites look like. This is the capital, Majuro, just a little part of it. It's a big atoll. Well, big, I mean, in terms of, saw it on this picture, is big in terms of size, but in the end, this is like all like 100 meter wide, so it's actually quite small. This is Medjid, the island I showed, which has a bit of a, it has beach, and you see, I don't know if you see it well, but there's like, between the sea and where the trees start, there is like a meter, 1.5 meter or so. And this is different here on Majuro, where there's almost no beach. So this is Cobra, what you see on the right. I forgot what the name was of the guy on the left. But Cobra is coconuts. You dry them, and they can store it, and they sell it to the ships that pass by, and they exchange it for rice. That is actually the main economic activity there. It's another picture from Majuro, where because it's quite crowded, so it's worth the effort to try and gain land in there. So people try to expand their land, and here they've used also garbage to do that. So I was wondering whether this is like a transformative adaptation to do it like this, to do something really new, or whether it's maybe a public health tragedy to use garbage to gain land. Last pictures here. Drought is actually probably a bigger problem for people in the Marshall Islands right now than sea level rise. But they have been able to deal with lower rainfall amounts by the government, and NGOs have come in to give these big water tanks. All households on those islands received some of those tanks so they can gather a lot of water, and at least they have enough drinking water. Start quickly. What we did is a mix of methods. So I was in Marshall Islands for several weeks, and the study we do in the US are like 3 or 4 weeks each, in Hawaii and in Northwest US. And we by now have interviewed 280 households, and so we use a questionnaire that's a common methodology used in this type of research. But we also use a Q methodology. It's an old method that's not been applied to our type of research much. It's really about people's perceptions, and I'll say a few more words about that later. But what we do is to combine this household data and social science with that more spatial analysis that I already mentioned. So we gather data from satellites, from migration census, and we combine it with our own data, and then hopefully that will give us like a stronger insight. I just received a 2-minute sign, so I'm going to be a bit fast so I have time for the findings. I have 3 slides with findings, so I have to be a bit fast there too. What are people's perceptions of climate change there? So first of all, I think this is a really important one, and also against my own expectation, because when you see those pictures, you say, wow, they're really, the sea is here, the land is there, and it's so close that there's no protection, that it must be a huge problem. People there are worried about the future, but they have not yet been really much affected by sea level rise. Their houses have never been flooded in most places we went to. Might be different in some other parts of the Marshall Islands, but actually drought was a bigger problem for them now. But they do see those sea level rise and climate change really as a risk for the future, because they always also, they've seen the changes, they see it come up, see the sea coming just a bit further each time, but it's just not really affected them yet. On the drivers of migration, what we see is that also I'd expected like a stronger climate signal in the reasons for people to migrate, but so far, when you ask people, they will emphasize like the employment, like work, moving for education reasons, moving for healthcare reasons, which was a bit of a new one for me. I've been working on migration for many years in healthcare, and it's rare, but here healthcare was a big thing, and also just a sort of pool of America. They hear about America. They have brothers, sisters, children there, and so they also want to figure out what's it like there or discover it. Now, importantly, people from the Marshall Islands have free access to the United States, which has they have this compact of free association. Goes back a long while to the nuclear tests that the US did in the 50s. So they sort of compensated for that, also giving people from the Marshall Islands free access to the US. So people are not really trapped there. They have that option once they can pay at least for the flight, and usually they can through help from relatives who are already there. Now, one important thing here is that while people there in the Marshall Islands did not yet mention climate impacts, climate threats as a reason to migrate, the people we interviewed in Hawaii, and we are currently interviewing in Northwest US, they say that they are worried that they will not be able to return to settle back on their island. So they're more exposed to information on climate change, and because this is about the future. So they are currently living in the US, but they feel that attachment to the area where they're from, but they're really afraid that they can't return. So last slide with findings on impacts of migration. So what we see is that also underlining the importance of doing research both in source and in destination areas of migrants. People in the Marshall Islands were much more negative about migration, while the migrants that we interviewed in the US were very positive about their move. So for them, their move to US had been very successful. There are a few, I won't go into the details here, but they see a lot of improvements in like indicators of well-being for themselves. So let me just take you to the like sort of takeaway message. I haven't been able to give you all the data on which this is based, but please take a second to just read what is there. So I realized that some of the data on which this statement is based, I've not been able to tell you yet, but maybe I'll have time for that in the questions. So thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Cosmin Correta. I work for the United Nations University Institute for Environment and Human Security here in Bonn. And I am very happy to be here, and I thank the IE, and in particular for having me here this morning. I don't have a PowerPoint, and I'm a lawyer, so I hope I won't be very boring in my 10 minutes. But I will try to focus on migration and adaptation, We saw lately in this COP, not only unfortunately, that adaptation is more, migration as adaptation is more measured at destination area. We think that migration is successful only if the people who are migrating temporarily to urban areas are sending good remittances back home and they help people adapting. But we don't see migration as being successful if it's temporary as a household per se. Some 10 years ago, we developed a methodology which is called hybrid approach. And from the legal perspective, this is a very simplistic kind of report. And we have a cause-effect report as having the climate change as being the main trigger. And from the lawyer's point of view, the first effect of this trigger would be a human right violation. Somewhere, somehow got his or her human right violation. I usually use the example of right to education. So if you have children and you have a household which is affected by floods, for example, with some climate change elements in the floods, let's be scientifically correct, then, for example, the right to education is affected. If you have elderly who do not have access to medical service, then you have right to health education, and so on and so on. Here you have two key subjects. The first one is the household which is affected, and the second one is the state, which is supposed to be there to protect the people from those human rights violations. The subsidiary effect of this is actually the migration decision. And the migration decision, unfortunately, and this COP shows that the number is increasing as well, that the people at household decision, they take the decision to migrate immediately after the first climate change stressors appears. And the number of those people globally is 30% and up. So instead of having migration as a successful source for adaptation and trying to have more successful adaptation measures in place, unfortunately the tendency these days in the world is quite opposite. The other subject in this case doesn't have much to say when the household decision is being taken. This is the state. And the state is passively witnessing the migration patterns in some parts of the world and most parts of the world being unregulated. So we don't have regular regional or necessarily national or domestic migration policies in place, which makes from the state a passive subject. So they cannot necessarily help. When the person takes the decision to go temporarily to the urban area, unfortunately, the state is not much of a help there. So keeping this in mind and moving on to adaptation as successful at destination areas, in the last couple of years, we developed a project in the Pacific, focusing on two target countries, which are Fiji and Vanuatu. We had a very deep legal analysis, and I have a report here, it's online everywhere these days, it's just been launched last Thursday. But it actually shows that from the legal perspective, states are not prepared to deal with migration, climate change, or human rights. One of the main findings of our report shows you may not talk today about climate change without referring to human rights or migration, or you cannot refer to migration, or if you want human mobility as a more inclusive concept of migration, displacement, and relocation, without referring to human rights and climate change. This interconnected and in this interrelation, it grows, and it grows every day, and that percentage of 30% of people deciding to move instantly after the first climate change trigger appears, it's a living proof in this direction. So these three elements are becoming one and together. And you, as I said, you may, from the political perspective and even from the policy development perspective, you may not address one without considering the other two. The research we conducted in the Pacific also shows that the state's capacity it has its roots in the hybrid approach, which I described a little bit earlier in a nutshell. It's also limited, and they don't have, as I said, migration policies in place. Sometimes the migration internally is regulated through different national adaptation plans. I'm talking only about in relation to climate change, so I'm not talking about labor migration here yet. And there is no regional frameworks as well. The international process, as IOM was presenting earlier today, Mariam, it's a slow process, and it takes time, and sometimes people, or politicians in particular, negotiators, have a huge problem with considering climate change as being a fact, mainly because scientifically, and we all know that in the room, you cannot separate climate-induced migration from different types of migration. So we saw in Keith's presentation as well that you have a lot of triggers when that household decision is being taken to migrate. You have better medical access to medical services, better education, new economic opportunities, and so on, and eventually some climate stresses which you have to adapt to address. And in the case of which I presented earlier was the example of floods. So from this perspective, the international slow process taking place these days with the global compact, which is supposed to come alive next year, and we are not aware, and we are not very sure actually that climate change will going to be present there in a significant changeable policy kind of presence, have a big presence in the compacts. Then the research we conducted in the last 2 years showed that the regional approach, it's the more effective one. The regional approach is more effective one, because of the international slow process, and secondly, because as we discussed earlier, the state's capacity is quite limited. The states don't have the capacity to address migration, cross-border migration in this case, without the help of the other states, mainly because of the limited financial resources or limited even human resources in some cases. So having a regional framework or developing a regional approach on migration might help in the future and might even go a little bit further and try to switch the idea of having successful migration measures as adaptation from the destination areas, which unfortunately this is the trend today, to actually to the source. And think of migration as being only temporary, and the solution for people to migrate and for them to increase their capacity to adaptation and resilience. This is in a nutshell what I wanted to talk to you about today. And if you have any questions, just let me know after that. Thank you so much.
Hello, I'm Vanessa Louie, and I'm a PhD student from Arizona State University, where I'm studying complex adaptive systems, governance, and adaptation. I'm also a lawyer. I've worked on the precursor to the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, and later I worked on adding ocean awareness, you can understand that as sustainability, for a ship's crew, as well as the connected model course for the International Maritime Organization's Safety, Training, and Watchkeeping Code. However, after seeing the rate at which glaciers were melting in Alaska, that's my home state, and where I originally come from, and living in the Netherlands at 4 meters below sea level, I began to think about sea level rise. I became deeply concerned for those people who would probably have to leave their home. And why? Well, in 1956, my mother and her family escaped from Hungary. As a consequence, I grew up with personal suffering and loss of place identity, especially my grandparents and my uncle. In fact, my uncle still struggles at 78 years of age. So with this in mind, I turned from law to adaptation. Yeah. I'm approaching, and I think it's important to hear that. Well, anyways, I won't take up more time. I'm approaching the issue of climate change-induced migration from the lens of adaptation and complex adaptive systems. Oops. And I would like to emphasize 2 aspects of the definition: in response to observed or expected changes, and to alleviate adverse impacts. I also want to emphasize 2 aspects of the system: purposeful and or unintentional, and this is referring to the actors who are migrating, as unintentionally you can think about reacting, as well as the other actors who are involved in the migration adaptation system, as well as the cross-scale aspect of migration, as well as adaptation. So I began my research asking, what will this adaptation look like if your land becomes uninhabitable? But I realized the question is not will, but the question is actually what is adaptation looking like now? People are experiencing a change in the climate, which has consequences for their living space. and in response are moving, attempting to move, or thinking about moving to alleviate the adverse impacts. So I argue that people are already relocating as a form of adaptation. However, how we frame it is relevant. Do we only frame it as a global security issue, as a humanitarian crisis, or also as climate change adaptation? I see that agency, the purposeful choice to consider relocation, should be enabled. Yes, also to potentially avoid global security issues and humanitarian crises, but primarily to encourage the purposeful choice to adapt. This actually is connected to what Patrick had already mentioned. To recognize the validity of individual and community agency in the face of sometimes nearly debilitating circumstances. So who are these actors in migrations adaptation, whether purposefully involved or unintentionally involved? In fact, you've already heard about quite a few of these actors. You've heard about governmental actors on the international level as well as the state level. You've heard about NGOs, a little bit, not extensively. And you've heard extensively about households and individuals who are actually migrating. I'm going to add another set of actors. The actors that often work with these governmental nonprofit organizations or local individuals. The actors who facilitate and are very present at the confluence of migration and adaptation. The actors that we sometimes leave out of the equation even though they can block or enable the best efforts of organizations working on migration and adaptation. Private profit sector. In fact, the private profit sector is becoming more self-conscious about its own involvement. If you look at the various side events at the COP23 going on right now, there have been many, in fact there's one occurring right as we're speaking, by the private sector examining what their role will and should be in climate change. And these discussions are explicitly including adaptation. There's no reason that the confluence of migration and adaptation cannot be included in this conversation. So how do private actors influence migration as adaptation? The most obvious interaction is provision of food and shelter for governmental organizations. Another obvious example is the businesses, both legal and illegal, which transport people for a fee from one location to another. You know about this in Arizona. However, I will not be talking about these obvious private actors. Instead, I am focusing on the private actors that for some reason we seem to leave out when we're considering migration as adaptation. However, I would like to include them because of their influence on migration outcomes, both as enabler and as barrier. The lack of purposefulness. Most of these actors are not aware of their influence on migration, let alone maybe even noticing migration. And the cross-scale interconnections. The potential tight coupling, for example, between a private profit international corporation and a local household or community attempting to deal with climate change impacts. I'll start with an example to illustrate what I'm talking about. Kivalina is a primarily Inupiat village located on a barrier island off the coast of Alaska. It has been eroding for a long time. However, with less sea ice and melting permafrost, the issue has become considerably more urgent. In response, the community has been attempting to move. Back in 2006, it looked like there were possibilities. However, the Private Engineering and Technical Service Corporation ignored local indigenous knowledge along with a few other issues, which I can talk about later, if there's time, which in the end created so much uncertainty that nothing happened. Later, in fact recently, about a year and a half ago, a different company was hired, which proceeded to take ice samples in a timely manner and remained in contact with and worked with the village. As a consequence, a road and a school are being built. This time, the private sector is acting as an enabler for migration. In the interest of time, I'm only going to discuss one other example. But as you can see, there are a few here, and there are actually quite a few more. There is a micro-index insurance program set up in Malawi with the backing of both governmental, NGO, and private sector with the goal of improving adaptation to climate change. It appears to have succeeded. However, I would like to note one sentence that is written in response within that paper to worsening drought. And this was work done by Dr. Suarez and Dr. Lina Ruth Beyer in 2010. With heightened premiums, farmers will be restricted in obtaining needed farm inputs, ultimately encouraging them to adapt to climate change by seeking other livelihoods. We know from where the rainfalls research done by actually 3 of the people here that this often means migration. In addition, many of these insurance programs are cross-scale, also in the world of microinsurance. A large international insurance company is often ultimately influencing whether or not a local farmer in Malawi will migrate. I think that this is an important connection that needs to be examined. I have a few other situations where the private sector is playing an influential role listed in the table. There are also cases where, for some reason, the influence is mentioned but not fleshed out, such as the role of private landowners who did not sell in the Carteret Island move that is now in progress. And for those of you that don't know, the peoples on the Carteret Islands are actually working on moving off of their islands. And this is in progress. Because of these internet connections, influences, and interdependencies, the question becomes what is equitable and just when interacting with the private sector in this very public space? And how can one govern in a legitimate, accountable, and transparent manner? Of course, these are all key questions in adaptation, but may become even more important when dealing with adaptation in motion. The vulnerability of those in the process of migrating away from their place, their home, only increases. Because of this, I am making several policy recommendations. However, I will emphasize two. Consider the cross-scale impacts of large private actors on local migration as adaptation, and attempt to influence the current private sector discussion as they explore their own role in climate change adaptation. If we policymakers, activists, and researchers within climate change want to enable and encourage equity and justice in the challenging situation of climate change-induced migration, we need to recognize and include the private sector as an integral actor. Before I end my presentation, I would like to make a request. I would like to conduct research in this migration and adaptation space using complex adaptive systems to examine the influence of the private sector, especially the cross-scale interactions. In addition, I believe in doing research that's policy relevant, useful, and connected to what is important to people who are currently practicing in this space of migration and adaptation. So basically you. And so I would like to know what you think. If you're willing, please take 2 Post-it notes and answer briefly, I don't want this to be a burden, the questions you see in the PowerPoint. And when you leave the room, please put them up on, there are 4 locations where you'll be able to see the questions. I'll pull those down so you can read them. And then if you could answer those, and I will be using the answers to guide my choices when writing up my dissertation prospectus in the next few months. So thank you very, very much. Post-it notes went?
Yes, already.
Oh, that side's already done?
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Okay, thank you very much for these very interesting and very insightful presentations. Now, I would like to ask the presenters to sit down right here, and I would like to ask you to please ask your questions. I think we will collect 3 or 4 questions in several rounds, and I would also like to ask you, if you ask a question, please tell us your name and, if applicable, also the organization you are presenting.
Hi, I'm Janine. I'm also with UNU EHS, but I'm not a scientist. I'm a comms person, so I hope you can still...
Sorry.
That wasn't me.
Wake up effect.
So I hope I can still ask a question because I'm not a scientist. So I have absolutely, most of the time I have no idea what my colleagues are talking about. So I hope this is okay. And first of all, big congratulations to the panel. I've been to a gazillion side events and this was by far the most interesting. So really interesting stuff. I have a question. When you talk about the movement to destination countries and following with the research and seeing how people settle in there, I thought that was quite interesting. If you can elaborate a little bit more on that in the examples of Marshall Islands, Thailand. But also, the effects of the communities that are being left behind. So if you could touch on, are you looking into that with your research? So once you have these migration movements to, was it Arkansas or Arizona, or to Hawaii, does that have an effect on the communities that are being left behind in Thailand as well? I'd be very interested in that. Thank you.
So no further questions so far? Okay.
Hi, Kaylee over with the Transweek Project. So my question's for Case, actually. And your case studies in Hawaii and the Pacific Northwest is interesting, and you said that it's very important to both interview migrants themselves and the places of origin, because there might be some kind of opposing or differing views. But my question is, if you were to say go to Arkansas, do you think the migrants, the Marshallese migrants there would be responding to the questions the same way? I'm from the US, and the states are super different in the way that they treat migrants and the protections perhaps you would receive in working conditions you would have. So that's just a food for thought question, that maybe do you think you'd have a different perspective if you had interviewed Marshallese migrants in Arkansas?
Hello, thank you for the explanations. My name is Ian Lee. I'm a postgraduate student at the Institute of Development Studies in England. I know nothing about migration. This is the first time I've ever been in a session about migration. We talk a lot at the Institute of Development Studies about alternative paradigms. My question is, why aren't we talking also about radical possibilities that perhaps are not too far off, like, for example, the abolition of frontiers, or even the abolition of money, at least credit, as it stands. I was a commodity broker originally, so I've seen the tyranny of what the financial world does. So are these questions that you have in your consciousness, or perhaps are not feel sort of constricted to talk about? Do you think that these are things that, if we talk about, could start creating an energy towards a step beyond that could solve the underlying problems of all questions of migration?
Okay, thank you. I think the last question for this round comes from within the panel. Maria?
I think the story you told us about Hungary, family missing even after several decades and so on. So I guess for anyone here in the panel, are you looking at questions of loss of, let's say even if migration is an adaptation to climate change, what does it mean in terms of loss of cultural heritage, loss of immaterial things like culture and places? That is it something that comes up when you speak to the migrants?
Well, I think Kees, apparently you are the guy to start.
Let me first start with the question about destination areas. Arkansas is indeed one of the places where a lot of Marshallese go, and there's another team doing pretty similar research now in Arkansas, so we decided to not copy their work and rather team up with them. We have a joint workshop in March coming up, but we do expect differences, and also how migrants perceive the success of their migration. For example, depends on who migrates. What are they more educated, less educated, blue-collar workers, or is it family reunion? But also the timing of their migration. So people have been moving to Arkansas for quite a long time already, and how people rate the success of their migration changes over the years. At the first years, often they really struggle, and then after some time they get more established and more successful, but they also may start you know, getting homesick and getting into problems with second generation, like, hey, identity, who are we, how do we maintain our links to the culture of places where we come from, etc. So we do expect many differences there, and so we'll do that like in a comparative way with the other team. I'll come back. Maybe you can first address Janine's question, and then I'll come back.
With regard to the question of following the migrants, we are following the migrants in our project to the cities, to Bangkok basically in Thailand, and also to Singapore and Germany, because our assumption is that the conditions in this place of destination are actually very crucial to understand how this connectedness to the place of origin is structured, basically. For example, for migrants who are going to Singapore, a country which very rigid kind of a migration regime, we see that people keep connected to the place of origin because they are kept in a state of, let's call it permanent temporariness. So the Singaporean state doesn't want a low-skilled migrant to be there for a long time, and so they are kept on temporary contracts and so on. So their orientation is towards the place of origin. And in terms of migration adaptation for the place of origin, means also that the remittances back home as being constant or increasing, and not as the remittance decay hypothesis of labor migration, saying that with time it decreases. So that's why we say, okay, we need to understand what's happening in this place of destination and how it influences the connectedness. For those working in Bangkok, as this one example should exemplify, if the working and living conditions are very precarious, migration's adaptation has a kind of positive potential. It's not possible. So that's why, and having this multi-local perspective has implications for policymakers as well, because how you treat migrants in your countries has an impact on the potential for migration adaptation. And so if you increase the conditions of migrants, giving them good jobs, security, you can embrace this potential in a better way.
Okay, just to follow up on that, I mean, a few years ago we conducted a study of conflict destination areas and the danger and the conditions the migrants are facing when they're arriving at the new homes, being temporary or permanent regardless, and we saw that impacting labor market, for example, can create conflict. You have a lot of loss of identity of the migrants who are arriving at destination area, being absorbed by the new society and being absorbed by the new way of life, and not being able to conserve, mainly due to limited resources, their own culture and identity. And for example, in the Pacific, we have land affinity, which is a huge part of their own identity. It's a little bit more complicated there. This is only in regards to addressing the identity which is lost at destination areas, and unfortunately, if you don't have strong communities of migrants at destination areas, this culture seems to be becomes very unpracticable in the very close future. And the 10 people, in order to socialize better, in order to integrate themselves and their families in the society, they have a tendency to adapt the new destination areas culture much faster, just for them to be able to cope with the difficulties they face as being or avoid discrimination, for example. Regarding your question, I think it's a very cool question, and I believe that this borderless concept should be a little bit. We should be a little bit careful when we're addressing it, because we are not coping very well with regional borderless concepts. And we have examples around the world, and you are in one now, that we don't necessarily like that much, having borderless kind of context in the European Union. But again, the fact that the countries are coming together in region in regional, I'm pushing for this regional approach because I see the need of it from the legal perspective a lot. It's much easier to negotiate with 32 countries than 196 or over 200 countries. And I think that regional also protects better values and traditions of the people who are characterized by the same values and traditions within the respective region, regardless if we're talking about the Pacific, Southeast Asia, or African context. But I think baby steps in that direction should be taken, and this regionalism as a concept should grow. And once we cope with that, good, maybe we can advance to these more adventurous concepts, as you mentioned.
I can respond to the radical one. Well, I just say that at Arizona State University, there's actually a School of Future Innovations, and they are discussing some of those topics. I don't know all the way. In my own work, I can tell you that I call relocation adaptation, because despite the fact that it's not acceptable in negotiations, it's considerably more acceptable than calling it a transformation. Because if you look theoretically, relocation of an entire community, that's what I'm looking at mostly, you're really looking at a transformation of that society. And so yes, I am dealing with it, but it doesn't need to be palatable, right?
Could I ask you, doesn't Kivalina show the limitations of sovereignty in the sense that the whole of Alaska is such an open country and so many resources, but sovereignty doesn't allow those people to immediately relocate?
It wasn't sovereignty, they own the land around Kivalina.
Oh, I see.
It's a corporation. I can talk to you afterwards about that.
Yeah, I think that the question about borders is interesting because, for example, here in the Pacific, there are several countries that have these sort of free access to other safer countries. Well, safe in some way. So Marshall Islands has that compact of free association with the US. I think there are other examples in the Pacific region, and so I think it would be an interesting proposal, because population numbers are relatively low in the Pacific, to maybe suggest for all low-lying Pacific islands to have some kind of direct access to another country, and not tell them you have to migrate and you have to move there. No, it's giving them that possibility so they will be able to expand their options, because we usually see that the outcomes of migration are most positive when people have a choice, and I think Miriam of IOM would agree that is what's coming out of all the real world examples. I have one question still for Miriam. Why is it so sensitive to talk about migration as adaptation in those? I never really understood that.
To be honest, me neither. It just is sensitive. I think it's, I'm guessing there's the money issue behind that. Like if you start speaking about having migration as an adaptation strategy, it's codified in the negotiation and so on, it probably means extra resources needing to be given to the countries experiencing this kind of migration. So we go back to the same divide by who's paying for what. I'm guessing that's the onset behind that. But yes, I mean, eventually what we're talking about, and Erica from UNHCR is here, she also follows that. Maybe you have also an opinion on this. I mean, we are talking about how we adapt to the adverse effect of climate change in terms of mobility, but we just don't speak the word.
Also, with regard to this question, I just had a very kind of disturbing experience a few days ago when I tried to present this kind of view, migration is adaptation, and embracing the potential of migration in the context of climate change, at the parliamentary meeting of the COP, saying that migration is not fake news, it's real, and impact, and but we should be careful with the numbers and so on. And then afterwards I was heavily criticized by members of the Green Party, saying that I'm kind of belittling the problem of the Pacific Islands and so on. And after the event, people from the kind of right-wing German party came to me and said, yeah, it's exactly the right thing you said, because the whole climate change, he was a climate skeptic, and was very, I didn't know how to deal with it. If you don't, you are not in the box saying that everything is really bad and millions of climate refugees, you are automatically in the other box, kind of being a climate skeptic, and I don't know how IOM is dealing with this kind of issue.
Can I still react to that? Because it actually ties into to something I wanted to say earlier. So where I come from, also where you come from, is sort of a positive view on migration. So, and this was my first time of working in the Pacific. I've been working with 5 years on this topic in Ghana, Africa, and then in a little bit in Asia, where, yeah, there were pros and cons of migration, but usually there was not so much sensitivity about migration. So when I started this field work, also already a little bit in the preparations for this field work, yeah, I got all kinds of alarm bells ringing around me, like, be careful, be careful, be careful. It's very sensitive. Well, what's sensitive about it? But then when I got there, I did realize that for people in the Pacific, the whole story is a bit different from the other places I've been to. So what's going on there is that people really see also migration as like giving up on adaptation. So you had those 2 bullet points in your slide where migration on the one hand can be a successful adaptation in itself, but also like a sign of failure. So it's the idea that lives in large parts of the Pacific, not just among the politicians or the policymakers, also among people. Like, if you talk about migration, you talk about the things you're not going to do to adapt locally, to keep those islands habitable into the future. So I think some of those sensitivities are real and really influence how you work on adaptation in this region.
Yeah, I think before our discussion becomes a bit too intrinsic, I would like to reopen it for the audience, and I think, or maybe we start with you because you have been directly approached by Maya.
Hi everyone, my name is Erica Bauer and I work with the United Nations Refugee Agency, UNHCR. And Miriam, thank you for that question, because it's also a question I was going to pose back at you. But just to throw another idea into the mix, I think there's this, obviously mobility is a spectrum from voluntary to forced, and these are all, you know, binaries that we impose. They're social constructs at the end of the day. And I think there's this emphasis on the forced element because it's somehow sexier, it's more, the media likes it more. So perhaps the reason why people are so fearful of migration and adaptations, because in their minds, migration is automatically this forced dimension, but clearly there's a more complex picture, and we need to begin to break down the stereotypes about what is associated around mobility more broadly. Then you mentioned that the current discourse in Warsaw International Mechanism space is really resistant to this language on adaptation, but that these issues may still be addressed in a twisted way. I think the term you used was twisted. And I would love to hear from you, and also perhaps from other panelists, a bit more clarity on what types of reframings we could utilize that would make this discussion a bit more palatable politically. Thanks.
Hello, my name is Alexa and I'm a graduate student from Indiana University. And I have 2 questions, if I may. One's just a bit more of a theoretical question, but we know that most climate-induced migration will be within borders, but for the populations who will have to locate into a new country, for countries that will completely disappear, just like hypothetically, how do you think these governments will handle relinquishing all of their power? Do you think that will be an easy process? And then my second question would be, Miriam, I was at the talk you gave yesterday in the Morocco pavilion. I promise I'm not talking to you. But my French may not be perfect, but if I remember correctly, you were talking about how a lot of times climate migrants can be seen as invisible migrants.
And I agree that we do need a regional approach to fixing this, but I'm also something that I find a lot when I'm reading about this is that there's a big concern for making sure that we have protection for cultural and like traditional knowledge and make sure that every community's culture will be respected. So I was wondering what legal processes you all think should be in place to ensure that will happen. Because I know there's a lot of hesitance to include climate migrants into the refugee, missing the word, but you know, thank you. So I was just wondering how you think legally we could handle that.
Thank you. I joined this debate, so I don't know if this has already been answered in any which way. So I'm Saransh, I come from India, and I'm a filmmaker, and we had done this film on internal migration within the Indian subcontinent, and the triggers that are caused by extreme weather events at different points of time, and how does that inform migration choices and such. So, but looking at it more broadly, I mean, migration is not something new, and has been happening since forever. But rather the kind of policies that have formulated and that were formulated, say, in the last 100 years, and of course after the very specific formation of very clear division and delineation of nation states, and then the rules and everything else. And now that we see the kind of market reforms which are expected of countries like India and other developing countries, but no labor market reforms in the developed countries, so to say. And then comes climate change and the migration happening because of climate change. But so then how does this, I mean, when you put it as like climate change and migration becomes a sob story, like do it out of your goodwill. But if you look at it the other way, that isn't it a necessity for the kind of labor which is required in the developed countries still, and hence there is, instead of it becoming a sob story, it can really be simply a story of requirement of labor and movement of labor from one region to another. Can it not be that? Because then the sob story will end and the real conversations will begin. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for your speeches. My name is Teresa. I'm an environmental science student, and I'm curious particularly about the people who very much wish to stay and remain, because you've touched upon the freedom of choice a bit, and also pointed out in the beginning that there should be an opportunity for people to stay, and in my understanding this would mean to make the places of origin habitable, and I was wondering if you have any specific tools or approaches to enhance these possibilities, because I can't really imagine how this works. Thank you.
Okay. Maya, I think these two questions.
I tried to take that. So on how to make the discussion more palatable at the political level, what I'm thinking is just my opinion, not an institutional opinion. So this Washington National Mechanism, which is where these discussions on human mobility and climate change are located in the Climate Convention. The main goal of this task force on displacement is to produce recommendation to avert displacement. So to me it's in that, so avert, minimize and address displacement. To me it's in that word, avert, prevent, that we can bring the whole migration and adaptation discourse. Like everything that we've all been talking about, I think that can fit into that averting, preventing displacement. So that would be my twisted way of doing it. Okay, so yes, on the invisible climate migrants, so what I was also saying a few days ago, for instance, we had a study in Bangladesh last year where 40% of the people that we interviewed, migrant household, told us that they migrated directly because of climate change, but for all intent and purpose, they are classified as economic migrants. So how, and I think you explained it, Cosmin, like it's just basically impossible to disentangle with a climate migrant, so with the economic migrants. That goes back also to the discussion about India. So can it be a story of only labor migration? I think it could, to an extent, but it's also important to talk about the climate drivers, because otherwise they remain invisible and we don't do anything about it. On the question of helping people to stay, so the specific tools and approaches, since you're an environmental scientist, you probably have better scientific ideas than I have, but I know that agencies like UNEP, for instance, UN Environment, they're starting to look at these kind of issues. On the IOM side, we mostly focus on things that we usually do, which is livelihood opportunities in places where there's already a lot of migration. But instead of having these labor opportunities in any industry, the idea here is to have it in the industry related to climate or land rehabilitation or climate adaptation. But this needs to be refined a lot more.
Okay, let's get the other way around. People wanting to stay. Research and science shows people do not want to move. It's a fact. They want to stay. The migration, it's sometimes displacement, that's forced migration, is seen as the last resort, relocation being something which people are hardly coping, even sometimes we have the US examples all over the place, the financial resources, and then still people have problems and still have identity issues and psychological problems as well to move. When you put that concept into a more landed, tied situations, like you have in Southeast Asia and in the Pacific, for example, that is even harder to achieve. The fact that they are moving is not most of the times their own choice, but it's something which is sometimes that is, and this is why unfortunately the discussion moves from migration as a voluntary process to forced migration, because their resources for and livelihoods are starting to become, and their life in general starting to become affected. Second question, I do not believe it's only a labor issue. Think of culture. And climate change is a fact, I think we all agree on that. And the stressors are there. And the people are affected by that, economically, but also culturally. I have tons of examples to give it to you, but we can talk about that more on the day. But it's not necessarily labor. Labor schemes are in place and may help temporarily, but they are not a permanent solution. In order to have permanent solution, you have to start regulating that. And this leads me to the third question. Is preemptive versus humanitarian crisis? What do you prefer? You prefer having a legal framework in place that when the scenario will happen, those countries, as you said, will disappear or not, or will be badly affected. People or states have regulatory measures in place and they can regulate migration in a fashion and human right respected way. Or you want to have humanitarian crisis. Leave it as it is, don't regulate it, don't have it as an adaptation, or don't have it under loss and damage, and then we'll see what happens. And you're gonna be shown on TV, being surprised that, oh my God, so many migrants are around us. So this is the third question. The fourth one, it's a funny fact. Displacement, Paris Agreement, it's only mentioned under Article 8, operationally. The human rights is not operational, it's only in the preamble, but it's still nice to have it. Secondly, the fact from the Secretariat perspective, loss and damage and the WIM and the XCOM are regulated under adaptation. So we don't see it as adaptation, but UNFCCC sees that technically from that perspective.
Just a brief response to the question, people want to stay, right? And perhaps I slightly disagree with you. People don't want to move unvoluntarily. Many people want to move, actually. And when you look at why people move, you need to look at kind of the social vulnerability. So it's that there's the environmental side and there are environmental stresses, but there are, on the other hand, there are kind of coping and adaptive capacity of people, right? And if you strengthen this coping and adaptive capacity in a way that people have the choice to stay, that are kind of ways to go, basically. Diversify income generating activities, basically making them less dependent on the resources on agriculture, for example. So people could stay in a rural area, which is very drought prone, but they are not kind of dependent on the agriculture, but on other sectors. and then they are not perhaps not forced to move there, but they will move anyway because they have the prospect of a different life, in urban areas, for example. So it's about the interplay between environmental stresses and the other side, the social side, the capacities of people to deal with it. And you can address kind of both sides in order to enhance kind of the freedom of people to move or to stay.
I would like to comment on that as well, because in some places, especially the tribes in Alaska, they have place identity. The land is them. Let me put it that way. I mean, actually, a lot of cultures do have that, but it's especially strong, and they want to maintain their subsistence culture. And so it's a great challenge and very difficult. And there are communities that are moving now, and they're struggling with that. Nutuk is moving to Matarvik. And there are people who want to stay in Nutuk. And it's a struggle. How are we going to support those people there, even though it's inundated almost all the time? So it's a challenge that will be ongoing.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we can have a last round of questions and comments before we come to the wrap-up phase.
Hello, my name is Anne Kruse. I'm currently at GIZ, and I have a question regarding remittances, because in some of the presentations you were talking about how migration can be used for the adaptation of the places of origin via remittances, for example, that can be invested in different kinds of adaptation. And I'm just wondering if it is not kind of problematic to always see the migrants as a solution for adaptation, because they are already struggling, because the places where they are going to, it's not that they have a really easygoing life there, but they are also the most vulnerable people in the places where they are moving to. Aren't we, in this sense, aren't we kind of targeting the wrong people as the ones who should do the adaptation?
Hi, my name is Benjamin Etzold. I work for BIC, Bonn International Center for Conversion, a think tank in the field of peace and conflict studies. And I was part of that former project where the rain falls with UNEO EHS. And I think some of the key issues that we also wanted to highlight in that project is that there's always transformations taking place, right? And we should not sort of investigate climate change and the impact on climate change on migration, the idea that climate change produces new migrations, but that we look at, in general, at societal and economic transformations and the transformations of migration systems, and then how climate change is an additional impact on these transformations. And what you mentioned, with people up in Canada or so they might be embedded in, there might be very deep transformations of their economic system in which they are embedded, which might be a lot more severe than actually the climate change changes. And the second aspect I think is important to highlight is that we should also look at migration in terms of a class aspect. And I think in the current policy debate we see a clear discursive disjuncture between talking about mobility of the highly educated, the elites and so forth, and migration of the poor. And I think this is needs to be highlighted. And I would suggest that, I don't know what's going on in the current debates at the COP, but I would be interested to hear your opinion about that, whether it's only the mobility of the poor that is being looked at.
Hi. So I just want to quickly respond to what was said. Yes, it is about migration, is definitely about culture as well. But the thing is that, as was evident, we studied 3 regions within India: the drylands, the coastal areas, and the mountains. And the place of migration where they were all headed to were the big city, and they are still the big cities, like Delhi, which is the capital. And while the people move, they don't, and as you said, that they don't want to move entirely. But what happens is that, say, a region like Odisha, which faces a lot of cyclones in India, what happens is that when they describe a period in time, 1965, when they had a drought. It is just called Mahakal. They do not have any other word for it. They just remember it's not as a year, but as an event. After which they just started migrating to different regions, and it has just become a kind of a pattern. But a family does not move entirely. Only some people in the family move, some people stay back. And they kind of strike that balance, and that's how they kind of adapt to it. And the culture doesn't get lost, because wherever they move to, they move in communities. In entire communities, inhabit a whole geographical area as their community. So the culture remains in that sense. It does not get lost. So the thing is that and that's why what I'm saying that we should look at it as a labor thing, because the biggest thing even within the country when they move is if they are citizens, they should all be the same. But the citizenship does not remain the same because they are disempowered when they move, because the government does not focus them on separately as simply a group of migrants. And when we classify them as climate refugees, then we disempower them even further. Rather, if we were to address just the migration and even a labor migration, like enabling as to what can enable them generally, then we would definitely have a lot more, I think, empowering conversation than talking about them as refugees, because refugee is not such an empowering term. Personally, I don't think so. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I just have another question for the panel that's related to this discussion, specifically on migration and adaptation. Do you think this whole discourse on migration and adaptation suffers from short-termism? Are we only thinking about what's happening in the next 20, 30 years? Are we not thinking about hundreds of years from now? And perhaps this is another reason why some countries are fearful about framing migration and adaptation in the policy space, is because they realize that you move Kivalina to a neighboring area, but then that community is also going to experience sea level rise maybe 30 more years down the line. So I guess I want to know how you think the discussion on migration and adaptation needs to evolve when we're looking on these longer term time horizons. And I guess how can we change the discourse to think about intergenerational equity as a more integral part of this discussion? And this question is wearing my hat as Erica, not as UNHCR. Thanks.
Okay, maybe let me combine the last and the first question, migration as adaptation. Are we talking about the right people, the migrants, to run the show? And is our time horizon really too limited? Who would like to respond?
I can respond to that.
Great.
I'll start with the time horizon. That's one of the issues with some of the private contractors. I didn't have time to say that, but because of melting permafrost, before they move, they have to check the land to find out if they're going to be moving in 20 years. So in some places, they actually are considering that. And I do think that you're right that when I'm also looking at entire countries that are trying to move, so like the Maldives. And yeah, I think that looking at it long term is scary because you have to start talking about issues of sovereignty and existence as a cultural identity. And I do think that's part of the challenge. And I argue that we should start thinking about it that way, but I understand why people don't want to. And I don't know that I'm ready to force that.
Yeah, I would also like to respond to the horizontal question, which is a very relevant and good question. But I think that in the range of adaptation options that are available, the migration part is the one maybe with a longer time horizon. So you have this distinction between more incremental adaptation and more transformational. So if you look at the things that can be done locally to adapt to, for example, sea level rise, but it could also be drought or else, if those are the things that you work hard to keep the place habitable, but there's like sort of a point where it's no longer really feasible. But with the migration part, it's really like that's a bigger step actually than all the small things that can be done locally. So I think that there will always be a time horizon question, but in the case of migration, I think it's a little bit less relevant than for most other adaptation measures. And maybe on the remittances question, it's a tough one because often what you see is that relatives support migrants to migrate. So there are lots of examples of that, especially in Africa. People who migrate across borders, you need a bit of money to do that, especially to reach Europe. So you see whole families putting savings together for one brother or son or daughter or sister to migrate. So there's a sort of a promise there, a social contract between the migrant and the family. And part of that is that, you know, when this migrant starts, you know, having jobs and having income to share some of that with his relatives behind, and that's a burden on them because they are already often in lower paid jobs in their destination area. But it's part of that contract. Sort of. Thank you.
Also, with regard to your question, you're right, and this discussion about migration adaptation is very often criticized as being in line with like a neoliberal narrative, actually shifting the responsibility away from states to people who are then very flexible and agents of adaptation. And we need to be careful that we don't talk about migration adaptation, potential of remittances. And the other question is you can't force people to spend all their money into climate smart agriculture and stuff like that. People will buy TV, cars, build their house and everything. That's completely another question. But we need to be careful that those who are also responsible, states who should kind of prepare and provide the conditions where people are able to adapt, don't get out of the game, right? And all the responsibilities with the migrants. I think there's potential for migration as adaptation, but it doesn't mean that other actors then can say, oh, migrants are doing it already, and so we don't have to do it. There's a real danger for that. And to your point that migrants are always kind of in miserable conditions, we are accepting this because it's very often the case, but it's actually produced to be so by the societies where migrants are going to, and we can actually, when we decide to do so, and increase the situation of migrants in all the areas where migrants are moving to. And so it becomes kind of a question of social justice and social inequality when we talk about migration adaptation. And that's perhaps also one reason that people don't want to touch it, because it then touches upon issues that societies are struggling with, and with migrants getting more complicated. We have all this discussion in Europe about it, who should get social support on, shouldn't get social support, and so on. And that's then the issue we have to talk about.
I will only reply to Erika's question as Cosmin Sasser, because I love your questions. But I think you have 2 points of view here. You have the policy option, and it's all around, and you have the human point of view. From the policy option, in 2015, Laurence Fabienne, one of the champions of the Paris Agreement, she invented these 2050 pathways, where countries have to become carbon neutral by 2050. Last night was a meeting Kes and I attended, and countries are stepping in and are joining the platform and are taking seriously more than NDCs. And if you would have listened to the programs they have and what they are intending to do under the presidency of the COP each year, this is an increasing beautifully process which happens. However, the human reaction came from the floor, and that was the Prime Minister of Tuvalu, who asked them why 2015 and not now. Because now we have a problem. In 2015, maybe it may become history, but now we have a problem. So even projecting that over 100 years ago is scary from the human perspective, mainly because they already have their feet wet. They are facing is Pacific. I mean, I'm talking about Pacific because this is where I work these days, but they are on the front line, so they are facing it like abruptly and sometimes aggressively. So even projection from the policy perspective on 2050, which I think it makes sense to give some time, especially to developed countries, in order to become carbon neutral. And it makes sense from the policy perspective, but from the human perspective, it doesn't. So it's a contradiction which you have to bury when you are trying to answer your question. Thank you.
Well, I see that there might be further questions or comments. I would like to ask you to do that right after the end of our session in the informal part, because now we will hear the wrap-up or formulation of some key or takeaway messages by Harald.
Thanks, Benjamin. Well, thank you very much for coming. Well, let me try to, I will try to give you a brief wrap-up. I think it's lots of stuff that's written here. It's quite small, I think. I hope I can convey the core messages that also you perceive. Well, for me, I try to sort this in three areas, like important messages that I took from the presentations, but also from the discussion, observations, and something that could be conveyed to, well, policymakers and everyone concerned with doing something. The first two things are linked. The impacts of climate change or migration are rather indirect, that I could take from here. It's not easy, if at all, to discern climate change impacts on migration from other reasons for migration decisions. There's a multitude of factors, of systems, of transformations, societal transformations, affecting migration and migration systems. One thing that's important to consider maybe is the legal perspective of climate change on livelihood situations. That's not a mainstream perspective, I would say. That relates to issues like the right to water, right to education, but also this popped up several times, the right to place, which is very important when we talk about especially resettlement schemes or habitability of places. Well, another field is these connections established through migration. So if people migrate, they are not gone, they are at some other places, but they keep connections to places, and they establish networks to people, networks between places, they remit money, they transmit ideas and so on. But what also happens is they don't give up their places, they still are connected to the places. That means right to place could also not only relate to people who are at the place, but also migrated to another place, but still connected to that place, making it more complex. One important message or thing is that migration, but also immobility, both of those, can be a sign for adaptation or for failure. And it depends very much on the exact context and the situation when discerning whether we should identify or denote either migration or immobility as a sign for failure or not. One important measure or indicator could be the intentionality, but also here again we have, it's not easy to say it's completely voluntary or involuntary. There might be a continuum or overlapping of fields here. One important thing is the time scale. How long must we think ahead for planning, for considering migration's adaptation, but also in judging whether something is a successful adaptation measure or not. We need to consider several levels. On the international level is important if we talk about climate justice and equity. Obviously, one important issue that popped up here in the discussion is linking international labor migration, or the right to international labor migration, with issues of climate equity and justice. A very, very interesting and promising area. On the national level, there needs things to be done because there's little focus on the rights of domestic migrants, which are the majority. 3/4 of the billion migrants we had in 2009, which might have been an increase, are domestic migrants. If people migrate to urban areas, there's very little focus on their often precarious living, working, and so on conditions. An intermediate level, which might be posing potential here, is the regional level. As national states often have little capacity of dealing with human rights, and the international processes are very slow, the global processes, an intermediate region level, especially in a legal basis, might be important here. And we have examples like ECOWAS coming up with regional migration regimes. Another thing that's important is the private sector, which is indeed very rarely thought about. And then we had brilliant examples how deeply and systemically private actors are very influential and linked through various fields of policy, but also fields of action of individual actors. Well, two observations that are here. Well, one thing that Mariam raised, migration is increasingly raised in the negotiations, in the climate negotiations, but indirectly. We talk about migration, but we don't say, we talk about adaptation, but we don't say adaptation due to various reasons that came up in the discussion. Interestingly, it's not self-evident that this has increased so much in the past year. So I think this is due to a number of actors, some of them in the room, who pushed this topic on the agenda of international negotiations. But it still is continuing to be a sensitive issue. So migration, international migration, is not an easy topic. One thing that I want to raise here again, that Patrick raised that very briefly, this framing of climate refugees and the creation of something like this, a discourse of fear, is something we should avoid. It's a nice thing to say we need to take action now, otherwise there will be millions, hundreds of millions of climate migrants. But this is on the back of real people really forced in the situations of forced displacement, and it's never helpful to create an atmosphere of fear of migration. I think in Europe we can very, very clearly observe that. So what should be done? One thing that would be important is consider the potential of migration for adaptation. In various dimensions and in various aspects, there is potential. It's still being researched. There's a number of international, larger, smaller research projects doing that. We still have a kind of sedentary bias, inclining to say, like, oh, if people migrate, they must have a reason, they must be forced somehow. In many cases, that's the case, that's true, but there's also other cases. But also at the same time, we should consider vulnerabilities and risks that come with migration. We're talking about loss of identity problems, culture loss, losses of places, relation of people to places, production of something like a poor migratory or migrant class. And we have this area of liberal resilience where migrants are taking over or pushed in the situation of it's your business to do adaptation because it's possible. Well, that means, on the other hand, that we should safeguard and ensure human security and human rights wherever they are, in the places of origin, in the places where they're living, in their places, on the move while they are migrating or moving, but also in the places of destination. So we need to consider all these places, and we need to consider the rights of people, not of people who are at some certain place. And that also means increasing the choice that people have to migrate. If people have more choice and they can plan and decide voluntarily, the likelihood is higher that any kind of migration movement will lead to adaptation. And finally, again, don't leave out the private sector. I put this in the last year because that's something that we in the project already been talking about. It's very influential, and also I think this is interesting, looking for their role, which is not really considered often. Yeah. But I hope I was able to convey mostly what we're talking about here. Thank you very much.
Great job.
No, I thank you very much because it was really a marvelous and remarkable wrap-up of our discussion that we had in the last 2 hours. So before we close, we would like to thank very much the presenters. I would like to thank our PR and Klimalotto, in particularly for making the projector run again. And I also would like to thank you for attending this very, very interesting session. And I would like to close actually with a pledge. I think it's really important, despite all the problems and sensitivities, to keep this discussion on migration as adaptation alive, and we all should really try to push it forward as a concept. So thank you very much. Have a good day and enjoy the rest of the COP. Thank you very much.